Hello, and welcome to the One in a Mini videocast with Rob Guzman. How are you doing today? I'm doing pretty well. So, a little bit of a late start this week. It's already Tuesday, and I didn't get to do this video a little earlier, so I decided let's try a little later in the week. Maybe more will happen, maybe there'll be more viewers. Let's see how it goes. So consider this a little bit of an experiment. As far as the content, we're not going to change much. So if this is your first time, welcome. If you're a regular, welcome back. And I have to say, we have quite a few topics to choose from this week. Lots happening in the news. What we do here in the One in the Many is we try to take the high-level principles out of the day-to-day headlines. So you're getting buffeted with headlines day in and day out. And what I'm trying to do for you as the viewer is to give you kind of a principled overview, a principled look at what's important and what isn't. So let's go over some of the things that I thought were important in the last week or so. So really there are three things I want to talk about. First thing I want to start with is the election results. So, as you know, we just had the midterm elections this last week in the United States. Congressional seats, Senate, House, and many governorships were open for election. I'm not going to cover all the statistics, all the races. I'm not going to give you every play-by-play and analyze each and every single race and whether, it was good the Republicans won or the Democrats won. That's not my job. And you can go to other places like Politico or the New York Times or one of these other like 538 and get that kind of play-by-play detail. That's not what I'm trying to do. Instead, what I want to do is I want to take a step back, look at the election as a whole, and analyze the results and, more importantly, the outcome and the reaction of the media to these results. What is being reported? What isn't? How is it being framed? What's the trend? And so on. So, one thing to note, which is kind of an interesting little headline, is some of the races still haven't been decided. Florida right now is undergoing some massive recounts. They're once again in the national spotlight, having had some suspicious ballot activity in Broward County. So we'll see how that shakes out. We don't know exactly who won that state in terms of governorship, senator, and so on. But the other states are more or less finished. And there were a few upsets. There were a few things that happened that were expected. So one thing I want to say, or there's a couple things I want to say about this election. So the first bit is this election, I don't think, was a real repudiation of Trump, nor was it an endorsement of Trump. I think there were several races that you could look at and say, well, the Democrats were expected to win it, and they won it. And others, you could say, the Republicans were expected to win it, and they won it. And there were a handful of races that were close. And as I had said, maybe Arizona, the Senate race there, was kind of an upset. I don't think anyone expected that to go Democratic. That's traditionally a Republican state. But overall, we didn't see a huge blue wave, as many of the commentators were expecting. And nor did we see a red tsunami or a red wall, as they were saying. It was more or less indecisive. Now, a couple things. One, many of the people who voted cited a variety of statistics in the exit polls, and they basically said that, and what was interesting about the exit polling was that about a third of the people who voted said Trump was not a factor in their votes. They were saying we were voting on local issues, we cared about what was happening in our state or our city. The rest of the voters were more or less split between wanting to impeach Trump and wanting to keep him in office or leave him alone. Not necessarily supporting him, but saying they didn't want to impeach him. So, and it was like a tight split, but it was more on the not impeached side than the impeached side. So that's interesting. It wasn't really seen as I don't think seen as a referendum on Trump, which is interesting. And that's really how it should be. I mean, the midterms should be about local elections, should be about states, voters in each state deciding how they want their state to go. So I think that's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. Now, one thing I will say is that I was very disappointed in the media and how they covered this election. And I shouldn't say that necessarily because I don't know what I was expecting, because the media has been so corrupt in our culture has been corrupt, but the media especially has been corrupt. And what I mean by this, why is it corrupt? It's the way they framed the results in terms of who won and what particular identity group each one of them was a part of. So this is just, to me, so sickening. There was one page I saw which had a number of firsts. And these were all Democrats, of course, right? But people were saying, well, look, we have the first Somali woman in Congress, we have the first Muslim woman in Congress, we have the first openly gay governor, and we've got this first, and this is like my favorite one, lesbian Native American congresswoman. Isn't that great? The first lesbian Native American congresswoman. Now all I need to do is get the first lesbian trans Native American congresswoman, and I'll have all my boxes checked and I can call bingo, right? That's how it works. You call bingo, you get every check mark, you get every demographic group possible in the Senate and the House. It's ridiculous, okay? Who cares what race you are, who you want to have sex with, what God you pray to, or any of this stuff? No one's talking about the important things, like where do these people stand on taxation? What do they care about immigration? Where are they on environmental policy? What do they think about environmentalism? Where are they in foreign affairs? What do they think about Iran and North Korea? What do they think about federalism? Do they think that free speech is something worth protecting? I mean, these are all issues that I care about as a voter, that you should care about as a voter, and these people aren't just tokens. They don't really care about what these people advocate for and what they don't. It's all, window dressing. It's all racial tokenism and identity politics gone mad. And I think it shows you the mentality of people in this country. The idea that they think that your demographic, your race, your gender, your ethnicity, whatever you want to call it, is somehow tethered to your ideas, your philosophy, the way you look at the world. And it's discouraging and sad. I was hoping that they would have a better coverage of the election and do a better job. But nope. They're just going to continue going on with this. So that was one big takeaway that I thought was very scary and an interesting development. Scary, but interesting development. Of course, the Democrats did win the House. That is an important development. Now you'll have a check on the Republican Party that's in power, which I don't necessarily see as a bad thing, although I don't have a lot of respect for Nancy Pelosi. She doesn't appear to be a very bright woman. She has been around for a very long time. I mean, the night that she won, she's cheering, let's hear it for preconditions, pre-existing conditions. Let's hear it for more pre-existing conditions. Nancy Pelosi is a pre-existing condition. She's a pre-existing condition on the body politic. She's been around since I was a kid. She's basically the figurehead for this Democratic obstructionist, group. Who knows what they're going to do with the kind of power they have now? Are they going to actually try to pass bills that maybe try to repel some of Trump's worst instincts, like on the tariffs and protectionism? Maybe try to help him with immigration reform a little bit? We'll see, but I doubt it. I'm sure they're going to try to impeach him. They may try to investigate his tax returns. They may do all this petty tribal stuff, so I'm not holding my breath. I generally think the Republicans are bad and the Democrats are bad, but I generally think the Republicans are a little less corrupt than the Democrats, so it would really surprise me if the Democratic majority in the House actually does something productive and something good for the country. I don't know if they'll do that. We'll see. Just some of my analysis, some of my outlook on this. So that's all I really want to say about the election. I know some people are talking about in Florida how the Democrats want to steal the election. People were talking about illegal ballots and illegal immigrants voting. I don't know if any of that's true. We need to see some evidence of that before I can actually say that it's true. But, there seems to be some evidence that there was foul play in Florida. So I think we should watch that election carefully and make sure nothing is going on. But that's all I really have to say about the election. Now, the next thing I want to talk about. So while we're on the subject of collectivism and the idea that people think that your ethnicity, your demographics determine your mind and your brain and your ideas, well, we can talk about another kind of collectivism, and that's economic collectivism. So for the last few years, as Trump has kind of risen to power in the Republican Party, the idea of free trade and the free market, although you can say Republicans never really understood the free market or what it means to have a free market, because they did still always advocate for regulation. And, it was Ronald Reagan who actually introduced the term social safety net into our language. And it was Nixon who created the FDA and the EPA and a variety of other programs. And it was Eisenhower before that who didn't repeal or try to repeal any of the the New Deal or any of that. So Republicans have really kind of dropped the ball on free market reforms in the United States. They do a little here and they're marginally better than Democrats, but for the most part, they're kind of mixed economy nothings on this issue. So I'm not expecting much. I'm not expecting like a Adam Smith or a Ludwig von Mises to run under the Republican ticket. But what I will say is that Democrats have been, at least in the last couple of years, on the whole, a little less anti-trade than the Trump Republicans have been. And what I can say now is that there is evidence that that's not true, that the Democrats are just as bad as the Republicans. They just have been less vocal about it. And here's some evidence. Here's some concretes. What I'm talking about, of course, is the Amazon plan to build a new headquarters in New York and Virginia. So this story just broke today that basically, on Tuesday, the 13th, basically the idea is Amazon wants to open up a new headquarters. And they went through this whole process of trying to vet cities and figure out where the best place to build their headquarters would be. And they ended up choosing New York City, here in Queens, and they chose Northern Virginia, so right outside of D.C. And all of a sudden, you're getting outcry from the left. You're hearing it from The Atlantic. I'm going to link The Atlantic article that I'm quoting from here in the show notes page. But The Atlantic had this article that was just horrendous about this issue. It basically saying that it's unjust that Amazon is allowed to do this, that they're allowed to basically select a venue for an office based on tax incentives from the state and local governments, that Americans shouldn't be subsidizing corporations to move their location from like one state to another, and that essentially they're robbing jobs from each other. So here's a quote from the article. So this article is written by a guy named Derek Thompson at The Atlantic. Its title is Amazon's HQ2, Headquarters 2, Spectacle Isn't Just Shameful, It Should Be Illegal. And the subtitle is, the subtext says, each year local governments spend nearly $100 billion to move headquarters and factories between states. It's a wasteful exercise that requires a national solution. So national solution. Doesn't that sound like someone you know? Sounds like Trump, doesn't it? Sounds like someone who's saying, we can't allow competition, we have to protect our industries, we need a national solution. This is a leftist at The Atlantic, typically a leftist rag, basically saying, we need to really clamp down on these corporations and they shouldn't be allowed to do this. And here's another interesting quote. So, here's a quote from the article. Did the world's smartest company, Amazon, really need 13 months and applications from 238 cities to reach the striking conclusion that it should invest in New York and D.C.? The former is America's heart of capital, and the latter is America's literal capital, where Jeff Bezos, chief executive of Amazon, already owns a house and a newspaper. Was this national auction nothing more than a scripted drama to raise the value of the inevitable winning bid? And did the retailer miss an opportunity to revitalize a Midwestern city by choosing to enrich the already rich East Coast? All good questions. But here's the big one. Why the hell are U.S. cities spending tens of billions of dollars to steal jobs from one another in the first place? Unquote. To steal jobs. So this sounds like something you would hear parodied in a South Park episode when they're trying to parody Republicans. Like the rednecks who are like, my jobs, bring me back my jobs. Here's this kind of condescending leftist type writing in The Atlantic who's basically mouthing the same position. And on the grounds that, why are we taxpayers giving these companies money to relocate? Well, I heard this not only, and this wasn't the first place I heard it. I work in IT, I work in technology, and my office is filled with lefties everywhere. And they have this company message board, and this particular article was linked, and people are talking about it, and people were basically piling on. One person said, well, I'm going to cancel Prime now because I can't stand this. And they link an article to CNN showing all the different regions in the country by unemployment rate. And the argument seems to be, both from this Atlantic article and from these folks in my office, these lefty types, the talking point for the lefty biosphere is basically that, what are these companies doing? They're being irresponsible. They're taking jobs away from the Midwest where they really need work and they need jobs and putting them in places that are already rich. And they're stealing jobs from one place to another. Well, for one thing, that's a totally collectivistic premise. Totally collectivistic. Regions don't own jobs. There's no American jobs, there's no New York jobs, there's no Chinese jobs, Massachusetts jobs, there's no South jobs or North jobs. There are just jobs, individual positions that an individual company puts out. They hire individual people to fill those jobs, whether that person's Chinese or American or English or British or French or whatever it is, whether they're from the South, the North, the East, or the West. Those people are hired on an individual basis by the company. It's an even trade for even gain. The individual benefits from the company for getting the salary, and the company benefits by paying the salary and getting the value of the work, whatever the person is doing, whatever skill they offer. Now, where these jobs are found, where they're offered, and where they hire is a function of a lot of things. Individual states should do a good job, I think, of trying to make their states palatable and attract more companies. I mean, this is something Ireland understands. Ireland, for example, is in the EU, but it basically has a really low corporate tax rate. It actually is a really good place to start a business. If you have a corporate headquarter and you want to basically save a lot of money on taxes, you should investigate Ireland. Hong Kong is the same way, and so is Singapore. These are countries that actually do a really good job of attracting companies to. These are countries that do a really good job of attracting companies to have their headquarters in their country. And how do they do it? Well, they have economic freedom. They offer these companies a haven where they can actually pay few taxes, get the protection of their property by the government, and they can hire and fire as they choose. So it's a really beautiful arrangement. Those companies benefit because they pay less in taxes, and the state government benefits because more jobs show up there, and people actually end up wanting to move there, and the economy does better. Now, if a state like New York or Virginia does offer a tax incentive or a tax break to somebody, to some company, that's their choice. But it's not subsidizing. If you're giving a tax credit, the money is taxed. The money that is taxed belonged to the original taxpayers in the first place. It didn't belong to the state. It's not like, the state owns my paycheck, gives me, some percentage of it back, and then they're using my money to pay these corporations. I mean, yes, the tax money that they're using to pay does come from me, ultimately, but really what's happening is that company is taxed less if they want to move their headquarters there. So it's not like they're giving them my money, it's like they're taking less away from Amazon. Now, if you really want to avoid being taxed more, right? The argument goes, well, Amazon will pay less to New York, so now we have to pay more. Well, why do we have to pay more? It's because they don't cut spending. It's because they keep upping the spending every year. Trump wanted to cut taxes, but that's kind of irrelevant because in the long run, the taxes are going to get raised in the future if the spending doesn't go down. The fact is, you can't have a government that cuts taxes and either keeps or raises spending. It's not sustainable. You're going to have to either print more money, which devalues the currency and results in basically a hidden tax, or you tax higher in the future to make up for the losses or the windfall, the difference. So as far as people complaining about how this affects their taxes, why don't they just have their governments tax them less? And in order to do that, why don't they actually have them spend less? Cut some of the entitlement programs. Get rid of Social Security and Medicare. You heard it first here. Get rid of those programs. They're immoral, they're evil, and they take in way more money than they need. And they're not even, like I said, it's immoral. You're taking from one person to give to another. So, again, this is basically a really skewed way to look at taxes if you think that Amazon getting a tax break is the same thing as you getting your taxes raised. What's really happening is there's a middleman, he's taking money from both of you, and the argument is, well, he's taking less from that person, so now he's going to take more from this person. Well, only if that guy is still spending as much as he was before on taxes, on spending rather. If you want him to take less from you, then have him spend less. That makes sense, right? So this is like really collectivistic on people's parts. Well, it's an ignorance of economics and how taxes work, but it's also collectivistic because they have this idea that a job is owed to a company or to a country or a state, that there are such things as New York jobs or Virginia jobs. I mean, if somebody is in the middle of Podunk District in Tennessee or Kansas, then why don't they move to a better area that has more jobs? Nothing stops them. It's not like, okay, I'm born here, I have to stay here, and now this government has to incentivize companies to come to me, and if they don't, then that's somehow wrong. It's like, the world doesn't revolve around you. What about what Amazon wants to do? Amazon also has an interest here. They're a private company. They have the money. They're the ones bringing the jobs and the riches and the employment opportunities to these places. These people should be grateful. These people in New York and Virginia should be grateful that these companies like Amazon are bringing them jobs, or bringing them an opportunity to use their skills. And one last thing I'll say about this. It's particularly nasty and evil when people that are in like my position, so people who I work with, my coworkers, it's disgusting to hear people who have jobs at a company like mine, which is basically a large company in Manhattan, headquartered in New York, okay? Doing exactly what Amazon is trying to do. These people have jobs, they live in Manhattan, and what they're trying to do is now say, well, I don't want more jobs in New York City. I don't want more traffic, right? That's what their argument is. I don't want more traffic. I don't want my rent to go up, right? More people, right? That's the whole idea. The number of apartments stays the same, more or less. You have more companies coming into New York. So what happens? Well, more people bid up the prices for apartments. So rent will go up. Rent will go up. Traffic will go up. Cost of living will go up. If that's the case and you're really concerned, then have them spend less taxes, fewer taxes. Like, if the cost of living is so high, why is that? Why is the cost of living high? Well, maybe you should ask the question, why is there rent control laws? Why do you have people who are unable to live? So with rent, this is a very complex issue, by the way. But I'll just say this. If you're concerned about rents being high, well, the first thing you should go after is rent control. Government meddling in the rental prices of New York City. Because what they do is they go in there and they say that the rent in this apartment cannot go above a certain amount. It is rent controlled. Now what happens is, if the supply and demand of apartments in the city is such that there is a shortage of apartments because the amount of people coming in has gone up, they can't legally raise the rent in that apartment. So what ends up happening is they spend less money on that apartment. It gets cruddier, gets shoddier over time. It loses its value. And they have two options. They can either build new places, okay, or they can just move their rental properties to other cities. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're moving them to New Jersey, or they're buying new large condos that are like really expensive to build and really luxury places, because the people who are left over, let's say you have 10 apartments, right? And let's say you rent control 5 of them. Now, those 5 people are locked in. They're paying a really low rent for a really nice apartment. Over the years, that apartment's going to go down in value because there's no incentive for you to put money in there. As a landlord, you're not going to be able to ever get a good return on that apartment because it's stuck. It's controlled. The rent is controlled by the government. You can't raise the price. So now what do? Well, you've still got 5 apartments. All the people who are not in the rent control buildings are now going to bid up the cost of those remaining 5 apartments. Now you have an option. If you own one of those 5 apartments, what are you going to do? You're going to raise your price. You're going to raise your price until you get some really wealthy programmer or executive who works for a company like Amazon to be able to afford the high rent. Now that's bad for that person. They're paying a higher rent than they would have otherwise, but it's even worse for all the middle class and lower class people because now they're outbid by the high level investors, the high level rent payers. But who's to blame for that? It's not the people coming in who are paying the high rents, and it's not the landlords. The landlords are making the best of a bad situation. They invest their money in those apartments, and now they can't raise the cost themselves because the government has told them they can't. So if you really want to point a finger, it's the government passing the rent control laws. But again, this is a point that I think is very true in economics. There's this idea of the seen and the unseen. And rent control, what people see is, oh boy, this is wonderful. This is great for me. I'm living in this rent-controlled apartment. I'm paying less than I otherwise would, right? Isn't that great? Well, reality doesn't work that way. What ends up happening is that money has to be made back somehow. In order not to go broke, the landlord has to find a way to raise their revenue. And they're going to do it by bidding up the price on the buildings that are not rent-controlled, or they're going to build new buildings that then are bid up in price by the people who are remaining outside of the rent-control pool. So you cannot just pass economic regulations and then expect the effects to go away because you think that it's a noble idea or that it's a good idea. It's either going to help or it's going to hurt, and that's an objective fact about economics. It's about supply and demand. And, feelings don't change the laws of economics. So there's that. Now, so what I want to conclude on this is the principle to take away from this is, and it's easy for people to get caught up in this, even in the Republican camp, all these Trump supporters, they get all fired up about China versus the U.S. Well, I have news for you. The U.S. doesn't trade with China. In fact, the U.S. doesn't really trade with anybody. What ends up happening is individual citizens in the U.S. trade with individual citizens in other countries. So really what the government should be doing is protect the private property of the individuals who are trading, but don't meddle and get in the way. Let people bid the prices up where they need to be bid up, and let the prices fall where they need to fall. Let the market actually correct for supply and demand. And that's the actual only rational way to handle it. So, this idea of a trade war with China is absurd, but equally absurd is this idea that, well, we need to, bring jobs back to unemployed areas. Well, some places, I have to be honest with you, don't deserve jobs. Why do they? I mean, if it's the middle of, Bumble F, Midwest, and no one's improving the land, nobody is actually building anything to attract investors, nobody has nice buildings for or amenities, or they have had high local taxes, they don't deserve jobs. Why should private companies bring all their hard-earned money there to have it pissed away to the local government? To me, it boggles my mind. But then, these people don't think in terms of individuals. They think in terms of collectives and groups. So it's yet again another example of collectivism in action. So that's the Amazon housing or Amazon headquarter issue. Now, the last point I want to talk about is an interesting one. It's a historical one. And that is the issue of nationalism and patriotism. So this last weekend, we commemorated in Europe, not we, but they commemorated in Europe, the anniversary of the signing of the armistice of World War I. So that's November 11th, 1918. And that war was the first major global war to hit the European continent since the Napoleonic Wars. It involved a huge loss of life. I think if you look at the number of casualties, all things considered, both sides, all civilians, and that includes the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, I think it's the third highest in terms of death. So very serious war. And you could even argue, as many historians do, that World War I led directly to World War II. In fact, the interwar period was kind of an intermission for what was really a larger scale conflict, because the combatants were more or less the same. It was still Germany versus England and France, with the United States intervening on behalf of the Western Allies. And even though the leadership of Germany changed and the reasons for going to war slightly changed, it actually still had to do with the N-word, which is nationalism. Now, nationalism is a word that has a very troubling history. In fact, I would say, as a big history buff and someone who knows a lot about history, that it's a word that should be viewed with suspicion by anyone who uses it. In other words, anyone who uses it should be viewed with suspicion, to clean that up a little bit. So, nationalism, in its purest form, is an ideology of collectivism. It says that what you should worry about, what you should value, is the nation, the group. It basically is this idea that the individual doesn't really matter. The individual should sacrifice for the state, for the nation state. So this viewpoint was very popular in World War I. In fact, in the months before World War I began in August of 1914. But in the run-up to that war, there were lots of jingoistic, very enthusiastic people singing songs, getting ready. They were all very happy to go to war, to fight on behalf of their country. Nationalism was a very popular sentiment. In fact, nationalism is what gave birth to a lot of the big countries in World War I. So Italy had united, Germany had united, even France and in the UK, at that time England, they were very nationalistic, all of them. And it was often along racial or ethnic lines, but ultimately the nation state as an entity was viewed as the supreme good. There's an old poem, I think it was Kipling, is a couplet that's very memorable to me. It's, ours is not to question why, ours is to do or die. That was the mentality of young men going to war for their country in World War I. So when Trump calls himself a nationalist, I'm not sure he fully understands the baggage that term has. I mean, when I think nationalism, I think of, Garibaldi uniting the Italian peninsula. I think of Bismarck's Germany. I think of the Kaiser declaring war. I think of imperialism, people colonizing parts of Africa and East Asia for the glory of their state. I think of World War I. I think of World War II. I think of Hitler and the Nazis. I think of Mussolini. I think of fascist Japan, fascist Spain. These are all, and even in the third world, I mean, a lot of Marxist satellite states like Vietnam was a very nationalistic conflict. The Soviet Union was actually a very nationalistic state, even though it was communist, which is allegedly an internationalist movement. It very much in the form that Stalin had brought it to the Soviet Union, it was very nationalistic. So, anyway, that's a bit of a history lesson, but nationalism does have baggage, and I think that it's not something that you should take lightly if you hear it. So this last weekend, Trump was in. So Trump had previously said that he's a nationalist, and he juxtaposes that with what he calls globalism, and a lot of his base use that term. And I think globalism, I've explained this in an earlier video, that globalism is actually a package deal. It's actually two different concepts that are smushed together. One of them is a good thing, and one of them is not a good thing. So the good thing on this hand, the good thing in that globalist package deal is free trade. The idea that, you basically want to get the best price and trade with the people who are going to give you the best value on a world scale. If I'm limited and restricted to trading with just the people in my neighborhood, I can get some products, but I may not be able to get everything I need or want. And if I expand my net to my state, and I expand that to my city, or to my country, and I expand it to my continent, and then eventually the world, now I've got a huger market, I've got more talent to draw upon, I've got more offers, more products, and I can find a better deal. So that's a good thing. Free trade allows people to kind of commercialize what they're best at, and specialize, and then they can divide the labor, and that actually results in a lot of wealth being created. So free trade, that's a good thing. What's not good about the globalist package deal is the idea of one world government or authoritarian states like the United Nations taking over everything, or the EU, or any kind of invalidation of American sovereignty. That's a very favorite target of the left. They don't like America, they hate it, they think that it's it is a bastion of freedom and capitalism. They don't like it for that reason. They think it's actually as Ayn Rand put it, it's a living refutation of their, it's a living, breathing refutation of their way of looking at the world. And the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba collapsed, all these countries collapse, and they basically are, they show the failure of socialism, the failure of their system, and so they hate the U.S. because it hasn't collapsed like they were promised it would. But anyway, aside from that, so you have this kind of Trumpian nationalistic versus globalistic mentality. So he said he was a nationalist, and then he went to Europe where they were commemorating this World War I. And you have Emmanuel Macron of France, the president of France, basically giving a speech that basically blasted nationalism. And I think, and I'll quote from that speech, he says, quote, "Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism. In saying our interests first, whatever happens to the others, you erase the most precious thing a nation can have, which makes it live, that which causes it to be great, and that which is most important, its moral values." And he went on to call nationalism as a revival of ancient demons. So what do I think about this? And this is an important principle. So this is something that I really, I selected this intentionally because it illustrates another variant of what's going on with the Amazon story. There's collectivism there. There's collectivism in the way the election results were broadcast and showed and analyzed. And here we have collectivism on the international stage. So Macron, again, is half right and half wrong in his remarks. He is right in that nationalism is an ancient demon, if you interpret it to mean collectivism for the sake of the state, for the sake of the group. That's evil, and it should be opposed. But what he's wrong about is, well, it's not that he objects to sacrifice to the state per se. It's that you're prioritizing your state over other states. So his objection isn't the sacrifice. It's not the fact that you're giving up your life for the sake of a state. There's no problem there, he thinks. His problem is, well, who are you to say that America is a better state than France or China or any of these other countries? What about the third world countries that can't take care of themselves? Shouldn't you be sacrificing for them too? How provincial are you? How limited? How, he says that it's a betrayal of the sort of common good, right? Well, that's no different from the people in the nationalist camp who call for sacrifice to the state. There's no difference in philosophy. They still believe in sacrifice. The only thing they're changing is the branding. They're only changing the type of sacrifice or who you're sacrificing to, right? Patriotism, as he points in his speech, is a valid virtue, provided that you are doing it based on ideas and your loyalty is based on your values. So, for example, I'm a patriotic American. I love America. I think it's a great country, and I would give a lot to protect this country. Now, that doesn't stem from a collectivized view of America. I don't think of myself as being an American because I was born here, or, it's not like my football team where I just root for them because I have feelings or emotions toward them. I do have sentimental emotions for America because it's made me who I am today in a lot of ways. It's helped me to kind of extend my wings and be myself and actually go out and make money, meet people, and live a happy and successful life. That is not due to collectivism, that's due to political freedom. And the United States has at its foundation the idea that you are free, that you have individual rights, and this country was the first country and remains the only country to be founded on an idea, not on a religious dogma, not on a tribal, ethnic kind of primitive savagery. It's nothing like that. It's all based on an idea that came out of the Enlightenment that says you are free. You are responsible for your own life. You should be left free to develop yourself to the best of your ability, and other people should not use force to get in your way. And it's the government's job to enforce and protect that. So I view myself as a patriot because I have values, and the U.S. government helps me realize my values. It helps protect me from force, from those who would prevent me from realizing my values. And that is different from nationalism. So I would say if you are a Trump supporter, if you think that Trump is right to use the word nationalistic, I would caution you there. It's kind of like people today, objectivists. For example, there's an objectivist named Amy Peikoff who recently on one of her interviews with Tucker Carlson she let him call her a feminist. And that I think is just totally wrong because feminism carries baggage today that makes it totally unusable by a rational, moral person. Basically, I think of feminism today as basically hatred of men. It's used as gender tribalism. It's a way to elevate women above men. And it's collectivism. And it no longer bears any resemblance to the people, for example, in the Seneca Falls Convention in the early part of the 20th century who were fighting for women's right to vote or women's right to own property. I mean, that's a totally different issue today from the girls who go on slut walks and try to deprive men of jobs and talk about how anyone who recognizes a man as being different from a woman, they're being a bigot or a misogynist. I mean, these are complete 180. They're complete opposites in terms of their philosophy. And so I would say the same thing here is true of nationalism. If you're a patriot and you value America as a land of freedom and a place where they have individual rights, then I wouldn't call myself a nationalist. I'd call myself a patriot, and I would distance myself from the nationalist label. So that's something to consider. Chew on that for a while and think about it. And as far as the European style of patriotism, the idea that you should be sacrificing not just for your own country, but for every country, you should reject that too. I mean, it's a false alternative, right? It's a false alternative to say that you either sacrifice for your country or you sacrifice for other countries. The point is, you can be against sacrifice, period. And that's what I am. And I say that people shouldn't be called upon to sacrifice for a greater good. Never. Not one that they don't choose, at least. And in that case, it's not a sacrifice. If you choose to give up some value for another value, that's a trade, and you do it freely. So I don't think that I would call myself a nationalist if I were a Trump supporter, and I don't think you should either. So something to consider on this Armistice Day, or the days after Armistice Day. So that's pretty much all I have for this week. Have a good rest of the week. Hopefully this finds you well on a Tuesday evening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.